Simon Banks and Peter McGorran. Simon, a very clear message on the program earlier from the Premier of South Australia to his federal counterparts. Get on with it. There needs to be urgency when it comes to social media reforms and protecting our young.
Look, I think that's dead right. I mean, you've had that conversation around the kitchen table yourself, as you mentioned, Kieran, and I think a lot of parents have. I think they're very worried about what's happening in social media. They do want to see some regulation of the space. They don't think the companies are doing enough themselves. I think voluntary codes and that are a thing of the past in that sense. I think they really do want government to step in and start regulating the space and make it safer for our kids. So change is coming, and I think the smarter IT and social media companies have heard that message. Unfortunately, there are too many laggards who are refusing to hear that message.
The coalition's hearing the message, Peter McGorran, and David Coleman was on earlier saying that he wants this to go harder and lift the age to 16, is his view, but he welcomed the move by Malinauskas. And it seems a no-brainer to me for Michelle Rowland to pick up that report from Robert French, the former High Court Chief Justice, and run with it, because that report says you can put these measures in place and put limits on social media for those, whether it be 14 or 16 and under.
Yes, Kieran, we're all rooting for the South Australian Premier. In fact, to be fair, Prime Minister Albanese endorsed him floating the idea several months ago. The question is not whether or not the South Australian government has the power, let alone the federal government, to impose restrictions. It's the enforcement that's the issue, which you touched on in your just now interview with the Premier. And I've taken a straw poll of young people this morning, and they think it's hilarious. They've already told me how they'd get around it if they were so minded. You can set up a fake email account, you can have different usernames and so on. I thought the most powerful extraction from the Premier, Kieran, was that he said that parents would be able to point to the legislation as a way of enforcing it with their children. In other words, if the parents are engaged, overlooking the children, then it will probably work. But if the parents are hands off, I think the kids will get around it.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. That's probably true for most things, but I can tell you from experience, I think that would empower a lot of people would have an impact certainly around the kitchen table. Let's turn our attention now to the debate around the economy. And wow, Wayne Swan, he had a red hot crack, didn't he, Simon, at the RBA, went a lot further than his protege when it comes to the criticism of their handling of rates.
Yeah, and Jim on the weekend actually made it pretty clear that he didn't support Wayne's comments. Look, the reality here is that we're in a really interesting part of the economic cycle. I think the next movement of interest rates is down. It's just a question of how soon that's going to come. Families out there are desperate for some interest rate relief. But the causes of that inflation are stubborn and persistent, and they come from a variety of causes, not just domestic, but most of them, in fact, international. So there are real challenges there. But the profile, if you like, that everyone agrees is that inflation is likely to come off the boil over the course of the next 12 to 18 months. It's really a question of how quickly does that happen, and how quickly does that flow through to interest rate cuts.
Yes, and the timing in answering that question, Peter McGorran, is going to be so pivotal to what happens next April or May when the government does go to the ballot box.
Exactly, Kieran. It will largely determine the outcome of the federal election. I think everybody's agreed, economists and politicians and commentators, there'll be no interest rate cut for the remainder of this calendar year, but there is a prospect in the first part of next year. The big issue for the government is whether or not they'll get the credit for it. Taking on the RBA and abusing the RBA was hubris on the part of the Treasurer, and then it was complete folly and stupidity on the part of Wayne Swan. Won't advance their cause. So even if interest rates come off, Kieran, in the lead up to the election, it's a question whether or not they come off much and whether it's too late politically for the government.
Peter, I know you're watching closely the US election today. The New York Times Siena poll has things a toss of the coin. We spoke about those pivotal moments in the Australian election. One looming in the United States this week, that being the presidential debate, Peter McGorran.
Yes, Kieran, which nobody can afford to miss because it will influence the polls because the Americans basically, by a slight majority, I believe, want to vote for Trump. But can you take the risk? And because of his character deficiency. So to me, that's what he's got to reassure Americans. Now, in the polls, I've wondered for a few weeks now, Kieran, why isn't Kamala Harris further ahead in the polls? By rights, she should be. This is too close to call. All 7 swing seats are within the margin for error, either for Harris or for Trump. So nobody can predict the outcome of this election. Bear in mind, though, that Trump is always slightly underrepresented in the polls. So he might actually be further ahead than you think at this stage, which to me is worrying for Harris.
Simon, we will have that debate 11 o'clock right here on this program, as it will be broadcast around the world. It's going to be, I think, compelling viewing on Wednesday.
Oh, absolutely. And I think this is really what the Trump campaign have really wanted since Kamala became the nominee for the Democrats. They've really struggled to actually kind of have a wrestling match with her. She's been able to avoid those sort of contests and that type of scrutiny. Well, this is going to be 2 people in the same room having a go at each other.
Yeah.
It's exactly the type of format that Trump and his campaign would want. But there are also risks there too. I mean, there's no doubt that Biden very clearly gave a disastrous performance and it ended his candidacy. But I think we also need to bear in mind that Trump's performance was not a lot better. In fact, it was a pretty bad performance himself in the last presidential debate. It was just that Biden's was so much worse that it covered it up. So he needs a good performance too, but he's getting at least the contest that he's finally been looking for.
Simon Banks, Peter McGorran, gentlemen, thanks. We'll talk to you soon.